Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You are watching Display Manager and Accessibility Options. In all of our previous lessons, we spent a considerable amount of time working from the command line, and in fact drilling home the importance of mastering this seemingly infinite, untamed terrain. And don't worry, I'm not going to tell you that it wasn't time well spent, but as you know, most of your users will be using a graphical user interface, or GUI. So consequently, we need to know how to properly configure it. My personal experience with GUI and video card configuration has been pretty smooth. Any issues I've encountered were easily rectified, but this is an area where even the smallest misstep could mean at a minimum a non-functioning GUI, but at its worst a blown monitor. And let me tell you, there is little that is more distressing than a smoking, sparking monitor. This lesson picks up where the X11 installation and configuration lesson left off. We'll cover the X login system, the X Display Manager protocol, then we'll review how to configure the X server. And for those times when you or one of your users needs to access the network remotely, we'll move into a discussion on X and remote access. And finally, we'll talk about the myriad of accessibility options for your users with special physical needs. Let's begin our lesson with a look at the X login system on the next slide. Imagine the panic your network users would face if they booted up their systems and only saw the blank screen and blinking cursor that is familiar to their network administrators or other technical enthusiasts. Not a pretty picture, right? Luckily, the X login system has come to the rescue. In order to log in, users are presented with a GUI interface, while text or command line logins are reserved typically for servers. Today, Linux's networked environments use the X Display Manager protocol. Now under this scenario, XDMCP, or the X Display Manager protocol, runs on a computer and at boot up starts the X server on the local computer, which in turn launches the GUI. Let's go first to our Fedora system, then Ubuntu, and take a look at both logins. Here's the login for Fedora. Now on our test system, we created a test user, so you see two names here, where normally your users would probably only see one. You'd simply click on the appropriate name and then enter the password. Now there are also some options along the bottom here. We've got language, we've got keyboard, got some accessibility, battery indicator, and the date and time. We'll talk about these a little bit later. You also have over here the option to suspend, restart, or shut down. Now let's move over to Ubuntu. Similar to Fedora, you have some options along the bottom here. Again, you got language, keyboard, the session that you want to run, again, accessibility options, date and time, and you've got some restart and shutdown options as well. Now let's head back to the presentation and continue the discussion. We've talked about the XDMCP server. You shouldn't be surprised to learn that there are several different types of display managers, but only three that you need to be familiar with for your Linux Plus certification exam. The first is X Display Manager, or XDM. Then you have the GNOME Display Manager, or GDM. And finally, KDE Display Manager, or KDM. You'll find that GDM is most often used as the default, but KDE is another very popular option, one that I plan to try out myself shortly. And as you may have gleaned, you can use either one on your system. On Fedora, for instance, you can install the KDE desktop, which will include the KDM Desktop Manager, with a yum install KDE desktop command. We'll get to that in just a moment. We've also spent quite a bit of time talking about the inittab file and sysv startup scripts, and how they're used to set default run levels, for instance run level 5 for an X login screen. And since we know that these files are used to launch startup programs, it should come as no surprise that you can also launch the Display Manager from either one of these channels. You set the default server in either the etc sysconfig desktop file for Fedora, using the Display Manager variable, or on Debian systems like our Ubuntu box, you use the sysv startup script. Let's take a look at both of these. Let's first switch over to Fedora. Let's open a terminal window from Applications, System Tools, and Terminal. Now let's type in ls, which is going to list the directory contents. We're going to type in /sysconfig and hit enter. Now what we're looking for is the desktop file, and as you can see here, we don't have it. And that's because we only have one option, GDM, at this point. Once you've installed KDE, you could create the file and just include one line, display manager equals KDM. Now let's take a quick look at Ubuntu. Okay, let's open a terminal window from here under Applications and Accessories. Under Ubuntu, the setting is in etc x11. So let's cd space etc x11. Now we're going to type in cat space default dash display manager and hit enter, and we can see that it's currently set to GDM. Now, curious about how a KDM login screen will look? Good, let's give it a shot. Let's head back to Fedora. Now remember that in order to get the KDM display manager, we have to install the KDE desktop environment. And we do that with the yum install command. So let's type in first su to obtain root privileges. Again, su stands for switch user. Type in our root password. Now let's type in yum space install space @ KDE-desktop and hit enter. Now first, yum will process any dependency information, and you see that scrolling by on the screen here. And once this process is done, it'll tell you how many packages need to be installed. And we can see that information has popped up here, 189 packages and the total size. From here we will say Y for yes. And then it goes through and downloads and installs the required files. One thing you'll notice about some KDE files is that they always have the K either in the name or in front of the name of the program. Now this installation isn't a quick one. It will take several minutes, but when it's done, our next step is to go ahead and create that desktop file where we can indicate the default display manager. So our installation is finally complete. The next step is to create the desktop file, and to do that we're going to use the vi program. So let's type in vi space, and we want to store that, if you recall, in the etc sysconfig directory. So we're going to type in vi space etc sysconfig desktop and hit enter. And we can see that we have a file, new file being created, etc sysconfig desktop. Again, we hit either I or A to enter insert mode. And if you recall, we only need one line, which is the display manager line, but I'm going to include a second. Let's type in all caps, desktop equals, and in quotation marks, I'm going to put in KDE for the new KDE desktop that we just installed. And hit enter. And on this line, we'll type in display manager in all caps. Followed by the equal sign. And we're going to put in quotes, KDM for the KDM display manager. Okay, so we should have two lines. First is desktop, which we're going to set to KDE, and the second line again is display manager, which we're going to set to KDM. We're going to hit the escape key, colon, and WQ to write our changes and quit. Hit enter. Let's type in ls. Actually, let's type in cat. We're going to look at the contents of this file. I'm going to type in cat space etc sysconfig desktop. Hit enter. And we can see the contents of the files just how we set it. Now there's also a GUI program called System Switch Display Manager that can do the same thing, but as you know, we like to work from the command line. Okay, now we're going to reboot the system and check out what our new KDM login screen and KDE desktop looks like. First, let's exit from here. And we're going to go to System, Shut Down, and click on Restart. And now we're at our new KDM login screen. We've got a spot here for the username and password. Then we've got some information here for session type. And as you see, we now have KDE as an option for the desktop environment along with GNOME and some other options as well. Under Menu, we've got the options to switch to another user, restart the X server, the remote login, console, or shutdown. Let's go ahead and log in. Be sure to select KDE from the menu, put in your username and password, and hit enter. And we'll see the new KDE desktop loading. Now there's a lot of debate on which desktop environment is best, whether it's GNOME, whether it's KDE, or one of the other options. In the end, it's one of those things that you should probably try out yourself and decide what's best for you. And now we have the new KDE desktop loaded. As you can see, it looks quite a bit different from what you might see with GNOME. And it's just one of those things that you'll have to, again, try out for yourself, see if this is something that you prefer or that your users may prefer. You access applications from here, and you have some other options. Well, I'll leave this to you to play around with and see how you like it, but for now, let's get back to the presentation. Now, I should note that this is another one of those areas where distributions may change file locations and names from release to release, so things may look a little different on your system. And also, the installation of KDM and the KDE desktop isn't currently part of the Linux Plus objectives. Next, let's move on and cover server configuration. So we've talked about the XDMCP server login screen options. Each of the display managers has its own configuration files that lets you tweak the settings you see on the screen at login time. XDM servers have their own set of configuration files, usually stored in etc x11. XDM's config files are first xdm-config, where you can set things like remote access, and the X-access file, which controls who can access the system remotely. And finally, you have the xresources file, which lets you set resources or variables like xlogin greeting, which can be used to change the text XDM displays on the login screen. KDM uses the KDM file, which is usually stored in either etc x11 KDM or etc KDE KDM. KDM, unlike XDM, adds the option to select Display Manager at login time. And you saw this on the XDM login screen that we just set up. You use the setting XDMCP equals true for network logins. And finally, we have GDM, which uses the gdm.conf file, usually in etc x11 GDM. Like KDM, GDM gives you other options at the login screen, like shutdown, restart, and some accessibility options. Again, these are the options that we saw along the bottom of the screen on both the Ubuntu and Fedora login screens. For GDM, the network login setting is xdmcp equals yes. And again, I should reiterate that file names and locations change from release to release. On our test systems, for example, these files don't exist. But for the purposes of certification, you should understand the file names and locations. Now let's move on and cover remote access on the next slide. In today's enterprises, it's not uncommon for both administrators and employees to work from somewhere other than the traditional office setting. You have road warriors, salespeople, executives, consultants, or other staff that spend the majority of their time at different locations throughout the year. Then you have administrators who may be tasked with managing servers located across the country or even the world. Then you may have a largely telecommuting staff that does most of their work from home. In either case, remote network access has become the norm rather than the exception. Linux allows you the ability to remotely log in to the server from both Linux and Windows computers. Remember when we talked about how the X server functions in the client-server model? The X server runs on the user's computer, and the clients are programs that run on the remote system. This is how the connection works. First, you log in to the client machine and open a terminal window. At the command prompt, you would type in xhost space plus server name, which is the name of the server that you want to connect to. Then you log into the server, preferably using a secure protocol like SSH. So you should have an account, of course, on that server that you want to log into. Once you've logged into the server, you will type in the command export space display in all caps equals client : 0.0. From there, you can run your programs from the command prompt. And then once you're done, to log off, you would type in xhost space - server name. Now let's review Linux's accessibility options on the next couple slides. Linux, like most operating systems, hasn't forgotten the fact that people with physical challenges also rely heavily on computers and technology. There are many settings that can be changed to help make using the computer a little easier. When you think of how we interact with the computer, while touchscreens are making some headway, we primarily use the keyboard and the mouse. And here are some of the settings that you can change. You have repeat keys, sticky keys, which are the Alt, Shift, and Control keys. You have a slow key option, bounce, mouse tracking, simulated mouse clicks, mouse emulation and navigation, mouse gestures, and you have the GNOME on-screen keyboard. Let's switch over to our test system and take a look at these. From the main menu, let's click on System, Preferences, and we'll start out with Keyboard. The first thing that you see here is repeat keys. Now you can change the repeat rate, which would be useful for folks whose fingers may need to linger on the keyboard a little longer than normal. You can change the delay and the speed, and you have some sliders here to help make adjustments. Now click on the Accessibility tab. First option that you have is sticky keys. Again, those are Control, Alt, and Shift. This option allows you to hit the key once and have it activated for the next regular key you press. This is perfect for your users who may have trouble pressing two keys at once. Then you have slow keys, which means that the key has to be pressed for a longer period of time before the system recognizes it. Bounce keys ignore fast duplicate key presses. This is for people who have a tendency to press a single key multiple times. Then you have the option to set here that your accessibility features can be toggled on and off with keyboard shortcuts. Let's click on the Mouse Keys tab. With this option, you can set it to have the pointer be used to control the keypad. Now let's take a look at some other mouse options. Let's go ahead and close here. Then click on System, Preferences, and scroll down to Mouse. And let's click on the Accessibility tab here. The first option is Simulated Secondary Click, which triggers a secondary click by holding down a primary button. Then we have Dwell Click, which initiates a click when the mouse pointer stops moving. This is also known as simulated mouse clicks. There's also another option called Mouse Gestures, and this can be used to launch a program. It works with drawn mouse patterns. So for instance, if you did a mouse pattern something like this, that could be assigned to launch a program. Now if you have a user who can't use a keyboard, you can use an on-screen keyboard, which works with mouse clicks. It's called the GNOME on-screen keyboard. To use the GNOME on-screen keyboard, you must first make sure the package is installed, either with the yum command, or if we click on System, Administration, and Add Remove Software, if we click on GOK and hit Enter, we can see that the package is already installed. And if yours isn't installed, then you can go ahead and install it, again using either yum or here from the Software Center. Let's cancel out of there. The next thing that we need to do is make sure that assistive technologies are enabled. So click on System, Preferences, and Assistive Technologies. Here we want to click on Enable. Then we'll have to close down, log out, and log back in. So go ahead and click Close and Log Out, and click on Log Out. And the system will take just a moment to bring the login screen back up. And then you can type in your password and choose your session type, and I'm going to select GNOME and hit Enter. And then when the system comes back up, we'll be able to test out the on-screen keyboard. From the main menu again, let's click on System, Preferences, and Assistive Technologies. Then click on Preferred Applications. And you want to make sure that GNOME on-screen keyboard is selected here. You see here you have the options to run it at startup, and that the command to start it from the command line is GOK. So go ahead and click Close. Then we're going to launch a terminal window. And from here we're going to type in GOK and hit Enter. It'll take just a moment for that to come up. Let's minimize this out of the way. And you see a little box show up here with some options. You've got a launcher which can launch applications, compose, window, some mouse options, activate, and some other options that will appear based on what application you're using. So let's first click on the launcher and let's launch a text editor. From here, let's click on Compose, and the keyboard will pop up. Move this down, and we have the keyboard. So let's type in something on the keyboard using our mouse. We'll click on H, E. What it will do is try to find a word for you, as you see that here. Oh, let's go back. Let's try again. We'll input an E, another L, and O. So you get the picture. And our command, or our word rather, is typed into the text editor that we see here. Now you have some other options to access the menu, just like you see the menu here. Let's go back. Then you have some window commands, which you can use to move the window around. Got some mouse options as well. The launcher we've seen. Click on Activate to activate different options. We've got the Nautilus desktop. We've got a terminal window. etc. And we've got some options to quit that we just looked at to quit the on-screen keyboard. Again, we had the menus that we saw. We've got toolbar options, and those are just the options that we see here. New, open, save, print, etc. Let's go back. And those are the options. Everything we've covered so far implies an uninhibited ability to read data on screen. But what about your users with visual impairment? One thing that can help is adjusting the size and/or style of the default fonts. And you can also adjust the screen contrast. Let's take a quick look at that. From the main menu again, let's click on System, Preferences, and Appearance. The first option we have is Theme. And if you scroll down, you can see that you have two high contrast themes that you could use. Let's click on one to give it a try. And you can see again immediately how that changes the screen and the look of things. You've got a couple options there. I'm going to switch back to our default. Now if we click on Fonts, we can change the size of the fonts, again, to make them bigger for users who have trouble viewing information on screen. And we'll close that. There's also another tool which is called KMag, which will enlarge the area around your cursor. And that you would have to install from either Yum or RPM. To use the KMag command, we just need to launch it from a terminal window. So click on Applications, System Tools, and Terminal. Then we'll type in KMag and hit Enter. And we'll see a little window pop up in which things that our mouse scrolls over will be magnified. Now this is in follow mouse mode, and there's settings here that you can use to change how the program works. And you can set the zoom here, a bunch of other options. Your users can try out all the options, which will find the combination that works best for them. Let's head back to the presentation. And there are yet more options for those who can't read the display at all. I remember trying text-to-speech technology many years ago. Linux has both the Orca and Emacs Speak programs. In terms of special displays, there is a Braille monitor that has a tactile display in Braille for text mode programs. To use this display, you must have Linux kernel of 2.6.26 or higher and the BRLTTY program. Now that concludes our lesson on Display Manager and accessibility options. Let's go over what we've learned on the next slide. The Display Manager works in conjunction with the X server to provide the Linux desktop login and environment. This is why the X11 server system is referred to as modular. In this lesson, we covered the X login system, which displays the system login screen. We reviewed the three types of XDM CP servers: XDM, GDM, and KDM. Then we talked about XDM CP server configuration. Next, we moved on to cover how the client-server model is used to facilitate remote access. We concluded this lesson with a look at accessibility options available for users with physical disabilities. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.